A Thursday morning in late October, fog so thick it swallowed the sea. A coastal village with no train station, no signal tower, and no reason for anyone outside of it to know it existed. And standing at the far end of a narrow cobblestone lane, perfectly still against a stone wall like he had grown out of it, was a man who had no business being anywhere this quiet. He had arrived before dawn. He had been watching the same door for over an hour without moving once, not to check his phone, not to adjust the collar of a coat that cost more than most of the buildings on this street. The flower shop across from him was dark. A hand-painted sign above the door read "Wren and Stone" in letters that looked like they had been written by someone who cared more about beauty than business. Buckets of dried lavender sat near the entrance. Everything about it was small, ordinary, alive in a way his world had never been. Then the light came on inside. A warm yellow glow pushed through the glass and landed on the wet stones at his feet. He watched. A shape moved behind the window, pulling something from a shelf, pausing to adjust a vase, moving with a rhythm built on repetition rather than survival. The door opened, and everything he had spent 3 years searching for stepped into the morning air. Seren. She looked different. Not worse. Not broken. Different the way a river looks different after carving a new path. Her hair was shorter, falling just past her jaw. She wore a canvas apron over a wool sweater, her hands already busy arranging lavender buckets into their usual places. She moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with the woman he remembered. That woman had been unsure of herself, always watching others to see if she was standing in the right place. This one didn't look up at all. She didn't need to. He almost spoke. Almost let her name fall from his mouth where it had been sitting for 3 years, heavy and unused. But before the sound could form, the door behind her swung open again and something small came rushing out. A girl, just past 2 years old, moving fast on unsteady legs, arms reaching for the lavender like the whole world existed just to be touched. She had dark hair that curled at the ends, round cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and when she looked up at her mother and laughed, the sound hit him somewhere he didn't have defenses for. Then the girl turned. Not toward him exactly, but enough. Enough for the fog to thin between them. Enough for the early light to catch her face. And he saw it. His jaw. The exact line of it. Miniature and soft but unmistakable. And her eyes. Dark green, sharp, too aware for someone that young. The same eyes that stared back at him from every mirror he had ever stood in front of. The world cracked. Something fractured along a line he didn't know existed, splitting open a space that filled immediately with something enormous and nameless. His breath left him in a single uneven exhale, and Seren heard it. Her head snapped up. Her eyes found him across the lane, and the recognition was instant, absolute, devastating. Every muscle in her body locked. The color left her face so fast it looked like something had been pulled from her by force. Then she grabbed the child. One fluid motion, arms closing around the girl and pulling her tight against her chest as she stepped backward through the door. The girl made a small sound of protest, reaching toward the lavender she had been about to touch. Seren didn't stop. The door slammed shut so hard the sign above it swung on its hooks. The lock turned. Then a second lock. Then silence. He stood there in the fog, the echo of that door still vibrating in the empty street. His daughter. The word moved through him like something alive. He had a daughter. She had his eyes, and she had been alive this entire time in a village that didn't exist on any map he had ever seen. Inside, the girl's voice filtered through the glass, small and bewildered. "Mama, who is that man? Why are we inside?" Silence. Then Seren's voice, tight, barely held together. "Nobody, sweetheart. He's nobody." And across the lane, the man who controlled the eastern seaboard, who had made grown men beg without raising his voice, who had never once in his life been called nobody, lowered himself onto the cold, wet cobblestones and sat down with his back against the wall. He didn't leave. He didn't knock. He just sat there, because for the first time in 3 years, he was close enough to hear her breathing, and that alone was more than he had allowed himself to hope for. Inside, the girl pressed her face to the window and whispered to no one, "Mama, the man looks cold. Should we bring him inside?" And Seren, standing in the dark of her shop with her hand pressed hard over her mouth, said nothing at all. The night they met was not supposed to change anything. It was supposed to be an evening she survived, not one she remembered. The Marchetti family hosted their annual winter ball every January in a converted cathedral on the north end of the city, where power dressed in silk and pretended to be civilized for a few hours. Every family of consequence attended. Every name that mattered was on the list. And every year, Seren Akhtar stood at the edge of it, invisible by design. She was the second daughter. The one people mentioned only in relation to someone else. Vesa's sister, they would say, or Akhtar's other girl, as if she existed only as a footnote. She had learned early that there were two kinds of people in rooms like this: those who were seen and those who made space for them. She had always been the second kind. She dressed carefully that night, not to stand out, but to belong just enough to avoid attention. A deep blue dress, simple, no jewelry, except a thin silver chain her mother had given her before she died. Vesa arrived as if the room had been built for her and was only now fulfilling its purpose. Red dress, sharp heels, hair swept up in a way that made people look twice and then a third time. She was everything Seren was not, and she had never let either of them forget it. The words came 20 minutes into the evening, delivered in the small courtyard behind the main hall, where the air was cold and the music was muffled enough to feel far away. Seren had stepped outside to breathe. Vesa followed as she always did when she sensed weakness, the way a blade finds the gap in armor not by accident but by instinct. "You know what's funny?" Vesa said, leaning against the stone railing, her champagne glass catching the light. Seren didn't answer. She had learned that answering only gave her sister more material. "I watched you walk in tonight," Vesa continued, her tone light, conversational, almost kind, which was always when it was most dangerous. "And I thought to myself, why does she keep coming?" A pause. Seren felt it land before the next words arrived, the way you feel a storm in the pressure change before the sky opens. "Nobody wants you here, Seren." Her sister's voice was soft, almost gentle, like she was delivering a truth meant to help. "You stand in corners. You hold drinks you never finish. You smile at people who forget your name before they've finished shaking your hand. And every year you come back like maybe this time it will be different. But it won't. Because nobody here wants you. Nobody anywhere wants you. And deep down, you already know that." The words didn't hit immediately. They sank, slowly, like water into stone, filling cracks she had spent years pretending were sealed. Her throat closed. Her eyes burned in a way she would not allow to become visible. She turned to go back inside because standing there meant absorbing more, and she had already absorbed a lifetime's worth. The main hall felt louder when she re-entered. She moved toward the far wall, toward the shadows, toward the place where she could disappear the way she always did. She never reached it. She felt him before she saw him. A shift in the room, not in noise or movement, but in attention. She looked up. He was already moving. Darvin Kale. The name alone made people step aside, not in fear exactly, but in recognition of something that operated on a level most of them would never reach. He ran the Eastern Territory and everything connected to it. He answered to no one. And in a room where every step was calculated, He was walking directly toward her. Not toward Vesa. Not toward the heads of families who had been trying to get his attention all night. Toward her. The girl in the blue dress standing by the far wall with champagne she hadn't touched, and eyes that were still red from words she would never repeat. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the scar along his left jaw, close enough that the noise of the room seemed to drop by half. "You're in my way," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. She blinked, confused, because she was standing against a wall with nothing behind her. "I'm not in anyone's way," she replied, and it came out quieter than she intended. Thin, almost apologetic. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression, a break in the composure that lasted just long enough for her to see it. "You are," he said again. "Because I've been trying to get to you for 20 minutes, and this room keeps getting in the way." She didn't understand. Not immediately. Her mind, still soaked in her sister's words, tried to reshape what he said into something that made sense. But his eyes held hers without wavering, without performing, without charm. And across the hall, standing in a circle of people who had already stopped talking, Vesa watched. And for the first time in her life, nobody was looking at her. That was how it began. Not with a declaration, but with a man who walked across a room full of powerful people and chose the one person everyone else had overlooked. And the sister who had told her nobody wanted her had to stand there and watch as the most powerful man in the building proved her wrong without saying a single word to her at all. 2 years. That was how long it lasted before everything burned. He didn't transform her into something she wasn't. He simply made space for her, real space that said you belong here, not because I brought you, but because you always did. She moved into his estate 3 months after the ball. He carried her single bag himself, which his men found baffling and she found unbearable in the best possible way. Vesa smiled through all of it. That should have been the warning. A woman like her sister did not lose gracefully. She did not watch someone she had spent a lifetime diminishing suddenly rise and simply accept it. But Seren, for the first time, was not watching her sister. She was looking forward instead of down, and that blind spot would cost her everything. The night it broke was not loud. It was constructed with precision by someone who had studied her for years. Seren had been at the estate for 20 months. She had started to trust the walls, the rhythm, the way Darvin's hand found the small of her back without looking, like his body knew where she was even when his mind was somewhere else. She trusted it so deeply that when the fracture came, she didn't hear it happening. Vesa had been visiting more frequently in recent weeks, softening her edges, laughing in ways that felt almost warm. Seren wanted to believe it was real. She wanted a sister more than she wanted to be right, and Vesa knew that. The study door was open when Seren passed it. Not fully, just enough to hear voices. Darvin's voice, low and familiar. And another man's, someone she didn't recognize, speaking in clipped tones. She should have kept walking. She almost did. But the words stopped her. "The arrangement holds," the man said. "Corridor access is fully secured. The family has cooperated on every front." A pause. Then Darvin's voice, flat. "And the other side?" "Managed," the man replied. She accepted the terms without resistance. As long as the agreement stands, both parties stay contained. The word landed like a blade. Contained. The floor tilted beneath her. Her mind tried to reject it, to find another explanation, but her body already knew. "Nobody wants you." Her sister's voice from the ball came back with full force. And now, standing in the hallway of a home she had believed was hers, she understood that Vesa had been right all along. He had not chosen her. He had acquired her. She was a clause in a deal she had never been told about, a tool so perfectly placed that she had mistaken purpose for love. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry. She turned and walked away with the calm precision she had practiced her entire life. The bag she packed was the same one he had carried in for her 20 months before. She took nothing he had given her. Not the clothes, not the keys, not the ring he had placed on her hand 6 months ago in a private ceremony she now understood was nothing more than a signature on a contract she had never read. She left it on the dresser, centered, deliberate, the only message she intended to leave behind. The service corridor was empty. The guards were occupied with a perimeter rotation she had memorized without meaning to. She started the engine of an unremarkable car from the lower garage and pulled away without looking back. She drove east, toward the coast, toward parts of the country where his name meant less, and the roads got narrower and the world shrank down to a size she could survive in. The numbness held for the first 3 hours. Then, somewhere on a dark stretch of highway, it cracked. Not into tears, not into screaming, into something worse. A settled certainty that everything she had ever been told about herself was true. She was not wanted. She had never been wanted. And the one time she allowed herself to believe otherwise, it had been a lie designed by the same sister who told her the truth in a courtyard 2 years ago. That was the thought she carried into the dark, into the silence, into the unknown miles ahead. And somewhere far behind, in an estate full of locked doors, the man she left had not yet realized she was gone. By the time he did, she would already be no one again. And this time, she intended to stay that way. She found Calder Cove the way birds find land after a storm, not by direction, but by exhaustion. The car died on a gravel road 3 miles from the coast, the engine coughing once and then going silent. She walked the rest, carrying the same bag, her shoes wrong for the terrain, her body running on something that wasn't energy but wasn't nothing either. The village appeared through the fog like it had been waiting for someone who wasn't looking. A harbor with boats that hadn't moved in days. Stone cottages pressed together against the wind. A single pub, a post office, a church with a crooked steeple, and a greenhouse at the edge of a cliff where an old woman grew flowers she sold to no one in particular. There was no welcome. There didn't need to be. Seren walked into the pub at midday, ordered tea she barely tasted, and sat by the window watching the sea like she was trying to memorize its emptiness. The woman behind the bar studied her for a long time without speaking. She had a face that recorded everything and shared nothing, weathered by salt air and years of minding her own business. You passing through or staying? Staying, Seren said, and the word felt like the first real thing she had spoken in days. There's a room above the chandler's shop. It's small. It leaks when the wind comes from the north, but it's cheap and it's empty. Seren took it without seeing it first. She paid in cash, gave a name that wasn't hers, and closed the door behind her like she was sealing herself into something instead of out of it. The room was exactly what the woman described, but it was hers. The first space in her life that belonged to no one else, that carried no expectations, that didn't come with invisible conditions she would only discover after it was too late. She found work at the greenhouse within a week. The old woman there, Margot, asked no questions about where she came from and offered no opinions about why she stayed. She simply handed her a pair of gloves and pointed toward seedlings that needed transplanting. Seren's hands learned the soil the way they had once learned to hold themselves still in crowded rooms. But this was different. The soil gave something back. Days became weeks. Weeks became something that almost resembled a life. She woke early, worked with her hands, ate alone, slept in a room where no one knew her name. The village accepted her without resistance, without curiosity, without any particular interest in where she had come from or why she stopped here. And every night she listened to the silence and waited for it to break. It never did. But the waiting never stopped, because somewhere deep in the part of herself she had locked away, She knew that men like Darvin Kale did not lose things. They recovered them. And the only question that mattered was whether she had gone far enough to become something he couldn't find. The sickness arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning while she was repotting lavender in the back of the greenhouse, a sudden vertigo that tilted the room sideways and sent her gripping the edge of the table with both hands. She told herself it was hunger. She had been eating less lately, her appetite thinning in ways she hadn't paid attention to because paying attention to herself had never been a priority. But the next morning it came again, and the morning after that. By the fourth day, Margot was watching her with an attention that meant she had already drawn her own conclusions, but was waiting for Seren to catch up. The clinic in Calder Cove was barely a clinic at all. A single room attached to the home of a retired doctor who still saw patients because no one else would. His hands were calm, his voice unhurried, and his eyes carried the particular kindness of someone who had spent decades learning that most people already knew what was wrong with them before they walked through his door. The test took minutes. The result took less. "You're carrying a child," he said simply. Not with drama, not with weight, just as a fact laid carefully on the table between them. Seren stared at him. The words entered her mind and sat there, refusing to connect to anything that made sense. Pregnant. The word didn't belong in the life she had built here. It belonged to the one she had left, to the estate, to the man whose hands she could still feel on the small of her back if she let herself remember. "How long?" she asked, her voice distant. "Several weeks at least. We can be more precise with time." She walked out of the clinic into the cold salt air and kept walking until she reached the edge of the cliff where the land dropped straight into the sea. She stood there for a long time, the wind pulling at her hair, the waves crashing below in a rhythm that didn't care about anything happening above. Pregnant with his child. The realization settled into her like a stone dropping through water, slow and irreversible, displacing everything it passed through. She had run from him. She had erased herself. She had become no one in a place that didn't exist, and none of it mattered now, because she was carrying something that would always connect her to the man she had tried to leave behind. If he ever found out, if he ever learned that she had taken not just herself, but his blood, his line, his continuation, he wouldn't just search, he would hunt. And men like him did not stop hunting until they had reclaimed what they believed was theirs. Rune was born on the quietest night Calder Cove had ever known. No wind, no waves, no sound at all, as if the world had drawn a breath and refused to let it go. Seren had expected the pain. She had prepared for it alone, methodically, because asking for help meant trusting someone, and trust was a door she had welded shut. But the body doesn't care about plans. It doesn't wait for permission or readiness. It simply decides, and you follow. The first contraction came while she was locking the greenhouse for the evening. Sharp, deep, spreading outward until there was nowhere left for it to go. She gripped the doorframe and breathed through it as she had taught herself to breathe through everything. By the time she reached the clinic, the contractions were beyond managing alone. The doctor was waiting. Margot was there too, standing by the door with her arms crossed and her face set in an expression that said she had known this was coming long before anyone told her. Neither spoke more than necessary. Instructions given in short, clear sentences. Hands guided her, held her upright when her body wanted to fold. The night stretched around them, that impossible silence pressing against the walls like it was trying to get inside. And then, without announcement, without fanfare, without any of the drama that had defined every other turning point in her life, the silence broke. A cry. Small, sharp, startling in the stillness. A girl. They placed her on Seren's chest, and the weight of her, the impossible warmth of something so small and so alive, landed in a place that had been empty for so long she had forgotten it existed. The baby's eyes opened almost immediately. Not the unfocused gaze of most newborns, but something alert, searching, as if she had arrived with a question she needed answered before she would agree to stay. Dark green, deep, vivid, unmistakable. His eyes. Serene's breath caught and something tore open that she had spent months sealing shut. She looked at her daughter and saw him looking back, not in threat, but in the permanent way that genetics makes its claims regardless of who is running from whom. She should have felt fear. Part of her did, buried deep beneath something much larger that was rising through her like a tide that couldn't be held back. She loved her. Instantly, completely, in a way that had nothing to do with choice, and everything to do with a truth that exists before you have words for it. Margot stood nearby, watching with an expression Seren couldn't quite read. "She's strong," the old woman said. Seren nodded, unable to speak, her arms tightening around the child who had just made everything infinitely more complicated and infinitely more worth protecting. She named her Rune, not for any meaning she could explain, but because the word felt like something hidden, something that carried power without announcing it, something that had to be discovered rather than displayed. Rune, with her father's eyes and her mother's silence, and a presence that filled the room in a way neither of them ever had alone. The world outside the clinic remained still. No wind, no waves. Just the vast dark of a village that didn't know what had just arrived inside it. And Seren, holding her daughter against her chest, feeling the small heartbeat against her own, made the only promise that mattered. "I will keep you hidden. I will keep you safe. And he will never know you exist." But promises made in silence have a way of being heard by the wrong people. And somewhere far away, in a city that never slept and never forgot, the search for her had not slowed. It had only changed shape. He did not realize she was gone until the next morning. That fact would stay with him longer than anything else, longer than the emptiness, longer than the 3 years that followed. He had been in a meeting when she left, a routine discussion about supply corridors and shifting territorial boundaries, the kind he had 100 times a year with men whose faces blurred because the details mattered more than the people delivering them. When it ended, he returned to their rooms expecting to find her reading or sleeping or standing by the window as she sometimes did when the estate felt too large. The room was empty. Not the way a room is empty when someone has stepped out. Empty the way a room is empty when something has been removed from it permanently. The air felt different. The space felt wider. And on the dresser, centered with a precision that felt like a sentence, sat the ring. His mind processed it in stages. First confusion, then disbelief. Then something colder that settled into his chest like a weight that would never fully lift. He searched the estate, then the grounds, then the city. Then every road, every contact, every connection he had built over a decade of controlling territory that stretched from the coast to the capital. Nothing. She had vanished with a precision that defined everything about her, slipping through the gaps in his world the way she had once slipped through the gaps in every room she entered, invisible by practice, gone by choice. The first weeks were methodical. Trackers, surveillance networks, informants in every port and transit hub within 500 miles. They found nothing. No trail, no sighting, no digital footprint, no mistake. She had taken an unregistered vehicle from the lower garage, driven east, and disappeared into a country that suddenly felt larger than he had ever understood it to be. The absence of her changed everything. Meetings he used to run with surgical focus now drifted. Alliances began to fray because the man holding them together was no longer fully present. His people noticed. They said nothing, but they noticed. It was the ring that kept pulling him back. Not the absence of it on her hand, but the placement on the dresser. Centered, deliberate. That was not the gesture of a woman who left in panic. She had left with purpose. And purpose meant a reason. He went back through everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment in the weeks before she disappeared. He replayed them with a focus that left no room for sleep or appetite or anything that wasn't understanding what had gone wrong. The answer didn't come from memory. It came from patterns. Vesa. Her sister had been visiting more frequently in the months before Seren left. Small visits, casual in tone. At the time, it had seemed like progress. Now it looked different. Now it looked like positioning. He started pulling threads. Carefully at first, then with increasing force as each one connected to something he hadn't expected. The consultant who had been in his study that night, a man named Farrell, had been brought in through a recommendation chain that traced back to a contact inside the Akhtar family network. Vesa's network. The conversation itself had been real, a genuine discussion about territorial access through the southern corridor in exchange for a political marriage between the Rinaldi and Corsetti families. But Farrell had been briefed by Vesa in advance. The language was deliberately chosen. Words like the arrangement and the family has cooperated and she accepted the terms and both parties stay contained. In context, those words referred to the Rinaldi matriarch and her territorial concessions, a deal that had nothing to do with Seren or their relationship. But overheard through a half-open door by someone who had spent a lifetime believing she was unwanted, those same words would have sounded like confirmation of every fear she had ever carried. The arrangement, the family, contained. He sat in the study where it had happened and felt something rearrange itself inside him. The door had been left open by design. Vesa had ensured Seren would walk past at the exact moment those words were being spoken. She had spent months softening her edges, rebuilding trust, positioning herself close enough to know exactly when and how to strike. She hadn't attacked him. She hadn't challenged his power. She had done something far worse. She had used the one thing Seren could never defend against, the belief that she was not truly wanted, and turned it into a weapon so precise that Seren didn't even question what she heard. She simply believed it, because believing it was easier than believing she deserved to be loved. The dismantling of Vesa's network took 4 months, not because it was large, but because it was hidden inside systems he had trusted. Connections severed, channels closed, people who had facilitated the operation removed with thoroughness that left no ambiguity. Vesa herself was the last. He did not handle it with rage. Rage was temporary and imprecise. He handled it with finality. She was cut off from every resource, every contact, and every protection her family name had ever provided. She didn't disappear dramatically. She simply ceased to matter. And when it was done, he stood in the same study and faced the truth that none of it had changed. She was still gone, and she had left believing he had never wanted her. That belief was out there somewhere, alive, shaping every decision she made, every wall she built, every morning she woke up alone. And he had no way to reach it. Not yet. But he would learn. The detail that found her was so small it shouldn't have existed. An artisan marketplace online, where people in forgotten places sold handmade things to strangers who wanted something real. Pressed flowers, dried arrangements, small bundles of lavender tied with twine. The shop was listed as Wren & Stone. The location was listed only as coastal. No town name, no address, no map pin. But there was a photograph. A single image showing wildflowers pressed between sheets of glass, and behind it, barely visible, reflected in the glass surface like a ghost the camera hadn't meant to capture, was a face. Her face. Thinner. Changed in ways he could not yet define, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent 3 years staring at every photograph he had of her. His man found it at 3 a.m. during a routine sweep of regional craft listings, one of 1,000 small digital nets cast across the country, each designed to catch exactly this kind of detail. The image was on his screen within minutes. He stared at it for longer than he would ever admit. The resolution was poor. The angle was accidental. She wasn't looking at the camera, but she was alive. She was somewhere, and she had built something. His people cross-referenced server data, payment processors, and postal logistics for the marketplace's shipping network. Within 72 hours, they had narrowed it to a stretch of coastline 200 miles east. Within a week, they had a village, Calder Cove. He had never heard of it. That was the point. He didn't send anyone ahead. 3 years of searching through other people's eyes had taught him that distance created gaps, and gaps were where she disappeared. This time, there would be no gap. He drove himself. 6 hours on roads that went from highway to county lane to gravel to something that barely qualified as a path. The landscape changed around him the way a world changes when you leave the parts that answer to money and power. The buildings shrank. The signs faded. The noise fell away until there was nothing left but the engine and the sea somewhere ahead, invisible behind fog. He arrived before dawn. The village was exactly what he expected and nothing he was prepared for. Small, forgotten, deliberate, a harbor, stone buildings, a church. And at the end of a narrow cobblestone lane, a flower shop with a hand-painted sign that read, "Wren and Stone," in letters that looked like they had been written by someone who had finally found a place to belong. He parked where the road ended and sat for a long time. His breathing was controlled, measured. But inside, something was unraveling. She was here, behind that door, in this village that the world had forgotten. The woman who had taken everything that mattered was living a life that had nothing to do with him. He stepped out into the cold. The fog wrapped around him immediately. He walked to the end of the lane and stopped across from the shop, his back against the stone wall, his eyes fixed on the dark windows. And he waited. Because this time, for the first time, he was close enough that waiting felt like more than he deserved. The light came on inside. A shape moved behind the glass. The door opened, and then his world split in two. Because she wasn't alone, and the child beside her had his eyes. He didn't leave that first morning. He didn't leave that afternoon. He didn't leave when the fog lifted and the sun came through in thin, pale shafts that made the wet cobblestones shine. He sat against the wall across from her shop, and he stayed. Inside, Seren moved through the morning with the careful rhythm of someone who had built a life on routine, because routine was the only thing that couldn't betray you. She arranged flowers. She swept the floor. She heated milk for Rune and set out the small wooden blocks the girl liked to stack into towers and knock over with a laugh that sounded exactly like freedom. But her hands shook. Just enough that she noticed, and that was already too much. She could feel him out there the way you feel, weather changing before you see it. A pressure in the air. A weight that hadn't been there yesterday. A presence that made the walls of her small shop feel thinner than they had ever felt before. Rune noticed first. She was too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something had shifted. She climbed onto the low bench beneath the front window and pressed her face against the glass. Her breath fogging the surface in small circles she immediately wiped away so she could see better. "Mama," she said, "the man is still there." "I know." "Why doesn't he come inside?" "Because I didn't invite him." Rune considered this, her small brow creasing in a way that looked so much like her father that Seren had to look away. "But he's cold. The stones are wet. He'll get sick." "He won't." "How do you know?" "Because men like him don't get sick. They just wait." It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it the moment the words left her mouth, because it acknowledged him as more than a stranger sitting on a street where he didn't belong. Rune pressed her palm flat against the glass, fingers spread wide like she was trying to reach through it. "He looks sad, Mama." Seren closed her eyes, a child's observation landing harder than anything an adult could have said. Because Rune was right. She had seen it when the door was open, in that fraction of a second before panic overrode everything else. The look on his face when he saw the child. Not anger. Not possession. Not the calculated assessment of a man evaluating an asset. Something broken. Something that had been carrying weight for a very long time and had just been handed more. By midday, the village had registered his presence. Glances from the fishermen returning to the harbor, a pause in conversation outside the post office. Margot, walking past on her way to the greenhouse, stopped and looked at him for a long time without speaking, then continued without changing her expression. No one approached him. Something about the way he sat, still and contained, communicated that this was not a situation that invited intervention. The pub owner brought him tea without being asked, set it on the stones beside him, nodded once, and walked away. He didn't touch it. When evening came and the light inside the shop turned warm against the darkening sky, Rune fell asleep on the bench by the window, her small hand still pressed against the glass as if holding his image in place while she surrendered to sleep. Suren stood in the back of the shop and felt the architecture of 3 years of carefully built certainty begin to give beneath her feet. He wasn't forcing anything. He wasn't demanding. He was just there, present, immovable. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Because force she could resist. Patience she wasn't sure she could. 3 days. That was how long the silence held before she broke it. Not because she was ready, but because the not knowing had become worse than any truth could be. And she had spent 3 years building her life on a version of events that was either the entire truth or something she couldn't afford to leave unexamined. She stepped outside at dusk on the 3rd evening. The air was cold and tasted of salt. He was in the same place, seated on the stones, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in days. His eyes found her the instant the door opened. Not searching, not surprised. Just ready, as if he had been sitting there specifically for this moment without knowing when it would come. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, keeping the threshold between them like a line she wasn't willing to erase. "You need to explain something to me," she said. Her voice was measured. She had practiced this. Not the words, but the tone, the control, the ability to speak to him without letting anything leak through the cracks. "I heard you. In the study. The night I left. I heard every word." His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes moved, like a mechanism reaching a position it had been waiting for. "What did you hear?" "The arrangement," she said, and the word tasted like poison even now. The family cooperated. She accepted the terms. Both parties stay contained. His voice, his study, his words. He was silent for a moment, not constructing a lie, processing the shape of something he had been trying to understand for 3 years. "That conversation was real," he said. She flinched. She hadn't expected him to admit it that quickly, and the confirmation hit her like something physical. "But it wasn't about you," he continued, his voice even, measured. The Southern Corridor arrangement was a negotiation between the Rinaldi and Corsetti families. Your family name came up because the corridor runs through Akhtar territory. She accepted the terms referred to the Rinaldi matriarch, who agreed to cede access rights. None of it had anything to do with us. Her arms tightened across her chest. That's convenient. It's the truth. And both parties stay contained? A negotiation term. Standard language for territorial agreements where both sides agree to limits. He paused. But your sister knew exactly how those words would sound to you if you heard them without context. She planted the consultant through her own network. She briefed him on what language to use. She knew the words arrangement and the family and contained would hit you in a specific way. She timed your walk through the hallway. She left the door open by exactly the right amount. Everything you heard was real. Every word of it. but none of it meant what she needed you to believe it meant. The silence between them stretched tight. She could hear the sea in the distance. And you expect me to believe that? I expect you to consider it, he said, not with force but with something quieter. Because you left without asking me. You heard fragments through a half-open door and built an entire truth from it. And I understand why. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I understand why, because your sister spent your entire life making you believe that you were not wanted. And when you heard words that confirmed it, you couldn't question them. That belief was older than me, older than us. And she knew it. She weaponized it. The words landed in a place she had spent 3 years trying to seal. She felt the cracks begin to spread through the version of events she had built her life around. Where is she now? Nowhere that matters. She stood there for a long time, the cold pressing against her skin, the dusk thickening around them, and felt the ground beneath her shift in a way that was more unsettling than the night she had left. Because anger she understood. Betrayal she had learned to survive. But the possibility that she had been wrong, that the life she ran from had been real, and the reason she ran had been manufactured by the one person who had always wanted her to fail, that was something she had no framework for. 3 years, she said. 3 years of raising her alone, of believing I was nothing to you. His voice broke just slightly on the response. I know. She looked at him, not as the man she had run from, but as someone sitting on wet stones in a village he had never heard of, who had not moved in 3 days, who was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that had ever mattered to him. And for the first time since she left, the certainty she had carried like armor began to feel less like protection and more like a cage she had built using her sister's blueprints. It did not resolve in a single moment. It happened as real things happen, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks that felt like they undid everything, and small advances easy to miss unless you were paying attention. He stayed on the outskirts, a rented room above the pub barely larger than the one Seren had first taken above the chandler's shop. He stripped himself of everything that marked him as what he was. No guards, no calls at odd hours, no reminders of the empire waiting for him. He walked to the flower shop every morning, not inside, just to the lane, to the wall where he had sat for 3 days, as if that spot had become a fixed point in a life that no longer had any others. Seren didn't invite him in, but she stopped locking the second lock. That was the first shift. So small it could have been accidental, except nothing Seren did was accidental. Rune was the one who crossed the distance. Children don't carry the architecture of adult pain. They don't understand borders drawn by betrayal or walls built from years of believing the wrong story. They see what's in front of them and respond with a clarity that adults have long since lost. She started watching him through the window, then waving. Then one morning, while Seren was arranging a delivery in the back, Rune opened the door herself, walked across the lane on her small, unsteady legs, and stood in front of him with fearless directness that made his chest ache in a way he had no defense against. You're always here, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Why? Because this is where you are. She considered this with gravity that should have been impossible for someone her size. Then she reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around 2 of his with surprising grip, and pulled. Come see my flowers. He looked past her to the shop. Through the glass, he could see Seren frozen in the doorway. Her face carried something between fear and the beginning of letting go. He didn't move until she nodded. It was small, barely visible, but it was permission, and he understood the weight of it. He let Rune lead him inside. The shop smelled like lavender and earth, and something warm he couldn't name. He stood in the middle of it, surrounded by flowers and glass and the careful beauty of a life she had built without him, and felt the full measure of what had been lost. Rune showed him everything. Every flower, every vase, every pressed arrangement. She talked constantly, and he listened with attention he had once reserved for negotiations that determine the fate of entire organizations. Seren stayed near the back, watching, not joining but not retreating either. Occupying the space between resistance and acceptance, where the hardest decisions are made. Weeks passed. He came every day. Rune claimed more of him each time, pulling him deeper into a world of small routines that felt more real than anything he had known in years. He learned which flowers she liked best. He learned that she stacked blocks in patterns following a logic only she understood. He learned that she talked to the lavender when she thought no one was listening, and that she slept with one hand open, palm up, as if waiting for someone to take it. The night it broke open was 3 in the morning, the village buried in darkness, the sea silent for once. Rune screamed. Not a cry, not a whimper. A scream, sharp and raw. The sound of a nightmare so real the child can't tell it's ended even after her eyes are open. Seren was on her feet in seconds, moving through the dark toward the small bed where Rune slept. But the knock came before she reached the bedroom door. Hard, urgent. Nothing like the patient stillness he had maintained for weeks. She opened the front door without thinking, because the only thing that mattered was the sound her daughter was making and the fact that it hadn't stopped. He was there, breathing hard, coat thrown on, his eyes wide with a fear she had never seen in him before. Fear that had nothing to do with enemies and everything to do with a child's scream cutting through the night. He moved past her on instinct, went straight to Rune's room, knelt beside the bed, and gathered her up in arms that had spent a lifetime learning force and only recently learned gentleness. Rune grabbed onto him immediately, her small body shaking, her face pressed against his neck, her fingers gripping his shirt like she was trying to anchor herself to something solid. He held her. That was all. He didn't speak. He didn't try to fix it with words or logic. He just held her, one hand cradling her head, the other pressed flat against her back, and he breathed slowly until her breathing matched his, and the shaking stopped, and the nightmare released its grip on her piece by piece. Seren stood in the doorway and watched her daughter fall asleep in her father's arms. Something she had been holding for 3 years, something tight and knotted that had lived in the center of her chest since the night she walked out of his estate, began to loosen. Not because he had earned it, not because the truth had been proven beyond doubt, but because the man kneeling on the floor of a flower shop in a village no one had ever heard of, holding a child he had only recently learned existed, was not performing. He was not calculating. He was simply there, present and terrified and unwilling to let go. When Rune was asleep and he had laid her back down with a care that made his hands tremble, he turned to find Seren still in the doorway, tears running silently down her face for the first time since she had left him. "I'm tired," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, stripped of every defense she had spent 3 years constructing. "I'm tired of doing this alone." He didn't reach for her. He didn't close the distance. He stood there and waited, because he had learned, slowly and at great cost, that the only doors worth walking through are the ones that open from the other side. She stepped forward. One step, small, uncertain, carrying the weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. She pressed her forehead against his chest and stood there, not speaking, just breathing against him, while 3 years of silence finally began to thin. He raised one hand and placed it against the back of her head, his fingers resting in her hair, and held still. Not because he wasn't shaking. He was. But because this moment was hers and he would not take it from her by moving too fast. They stood like that in the dark of the flower shop with their daughter sleeping behind them and the sea outside holding its breath. No ceremony followed, no declaration. That was not how real things rebuilt themselves. Instead, it happened in mornings, in the door staying open, in Rune running across the lane without anyone stopping her, in his hands learning to arrange flowers because she showed him how, and he wanted to learn. In the first time she laughed in front of him, sudden and unguarded, and then looked startled by the sound, like she had forgotten that part of herself existed. In the first time he said her name and she didn't flinch. In the evening when Rune fell asleep between them on the small sofa in the back of the shop, and neither of them moved because moving would have broken something that was still forming, still fragile, still learning how to hold weight. The village absorbed them without comment, without spectacle. Margot left a jar of preserved lemons on the shop counter one morning with a note that read, "For 3." The pub owner added a second chair to the table by the window without being asked. The fishermen nodded at him the way they nodded at everyone who had stayed long enough to matter. And one morning, weeks later, Seren stood in the doorway of Wren and Stone and looked across the lane where he had once sat for 3 days in the cold, waiting for a door to open. The wall was empty now, because he was inside. Rune was on his shoulders, reaching for a hanging fern, laughing in that way that made the whole shop feel warmer and more alive than it had ever been. And the door behind Seren was open, not because she had forgotten to close it, but because she no longer needed to. That was how it ended. Not with a locked door or a slammed one, but with a door left open on a quiet morning in a village that had taught her something no amount of power or pain ever could. That the people who truly want you don't walk away when you tell them to. They sit down on the cold ground and they wait. And if you are very lucky and very brave, you eventually stop making them.